Okay, welcome back to the fourth in this lecture series on the basics of economic regulation. In this video lecture, we're going to be talking about particularly the idea of public enterprise and franchise bidding. Now, what these are two alternatives to the regulation of private industries. So, in the case of public enterprise, what we're doing is we're going to have the state or the government run the business rather than have the private sector operate it. Now, there are of course a host of these that exist, right? In a lot of cities across the United States, waste management and trash pickup is handled by the municipality, right? Generally, fire protection services are offered, by the city. Not necessarily by the private sector. Another sort of way of looking at this or doing is to engage in franchise bidding. And what franchise bidding means is that we're going to allow the community, right, is going to allow a particular firm to be the sole operator in a given industry. So this is very common in ports, seaports, and airports, where we allow individual operator, private operator, to operate the airport or the seaport or terminals within the airport or the seaport in the public interest, right? All right, so the first of these, and the one we're going to spend less time on today, is the idea of a public enterprise. And so this is the idea we're going to have the public sector or the government essentially run a given industry. Now, without belaboring the problem of monopoly, there are, of course, when we have a monopoly, natural or otherwise, right, all the sort of good things that we think about occurring as a result of competitive markets aren't going to occur. So, for example, there's no reason for a monopolist to cost minimize. There's no reason for a monopolist to really be very innovative. There's no reason for a monopolist to really hire on the best people. There's no reason for a monopolist to sort of provide superior customer service. So sort of all sort of good things that we think about coming about as a result of competition don't necessarily occur. Okay, so in these cases, it may make sense for the public sector to simply operate these things. Now, that said, we should recognize that there are limits to this, right? So why not just have the public sector operate everything? Well, the public sector, of course, is a sort of monopoly of its own sort, right? And so here we see this sort of idea that if the public sector can't operate at the same cost as the private sector, then of course we have a situation where the market outcomes are inferior to what would occur in a competitive market. And so here we have the idea that ACH is the public sector cost structure, and ACE, AC being average cost, ACE being the private sector cost function. And so we can very simply sketch in a demand relationship of our choosing, in this case D, okay, and then illustrate that the price ends up being higher, the service ends up being reduced, quantity of service ends up being reduced, and of course overall consumer welfare is reduced. Okay, so that's sort of a economist formalization of this, the effects of operating an industry in the public sector at a higher cost structure than would have occurred in the private sector. All right, so recognizing that having the public sector operate industries may be a solution, but also recognizing the problem that we have to ensure that the public sector can operate this industry at a set of prices that's comparable to what the private sector would do. It may be that they're cheaper too. I mean, it's not impossible. Let's then move on to this idea of franchise bidding. Now, as I said a little while ago, franchise bidding is the idea that we're going to award a single firm the right to operate in a given industry. So, my experience with these is in seaports, right, where we would, you might have like in a large seaport, you're going to have a variety of terminals. So you might have a bulk terminal, a grain terminal, an oil terminal, and so on and so forth. And what you're going to do is you obviously can't have 20 competitors operating there, right? It's not space. So what you do is you award the right to operate that terminal to one firm. Other examples of that are like trash service. I know that in my home city here, right, we're always sort of talking about whether we should, because we've got 5 different trash operators, right? So on a Tuesday, 5 different trash trucks come down my street and pick up trash. And that seems maybe a little wasteful. Like maybe we should just have one trash truck come down. And so that we talk about this idea of like maybe we should just award it to, one company to handle all the trash service for the city. Okay. And so that's an option that sort of people pursue. But as economists, right, our role is to sort of think about how that's likely to play out if we go down that route. In other words, what are the sort of pros and cons of a franchise situation, and what sort of structure do we need to put in place to make sure that it sort of works out in if not an optimal way, at least as close to an optimal way as we can design. The sort of first idea that sort of the most basic idea of franchise bidding might be this idea of sort of an English auction form, right? And sort of how we would do that is the government might put out a call and say, okay, well, we need somebody to provide trash service in our community, and we would like you, various potential providers from the private sector, to tell us, what price you can do that at. Okay, and that can take a couple. You can do it in a couple different ways. You could do it. What price can you offer to the consumers, right? Or it could be set up in a way where you say, what amount are you willing to pay us, the city, to get the right to operate in this community, and then charge a given price. Okay. In this way, right, with either of those routes, okay, the more efficient firms, that is to say the ones that operate at a lower cost structure, are going to be able to outbid their competitors, right? So if a firm is able to provide this trash service, seems like such a boring example, but it's the first one that comes to mind because it's quite common for cities to do this. We think about the companies that are going to apply to provide trash service. One will say, okay, well, I can provide it to an average household for $20 a month, or another one that operates with a lower cost structure might be, oh, I can do it for $18 a month. Okay, well, I can, or so on and so forth, right? So what this sort of bidding process does is it institutes competitive forces into a process that would otherwise not be competitive, which is a lot of what regulation does, right? In this case, we're not really regulating, it's a franchise, but we're introducing the idea of competitive pressure where it wouldn't have otherwise existed. Okay, now over here on the other side of the screen, we see sort of this idea where we've got 4 different firms, AC1 through AC4, that operate with different cost structures, and they're able to, depending if they're paying a franchise fee technically to the city to operate, right, then we've got P1, 2, 3, and 4 that represents the fee. And if we're thinking about this in terms of a cost to provide service, right, then it would be the other way. But in either case, what we see is that we're able to sort of find out what firm can do this at the lowest costs, right, and then allow them to operate exclusively within this environment. Okay, now that sounds all really well and good, right? I'm sure there's a few naysayers out there like, well, you forgot, yeah, that's right. It's not that simple, right? So the tricky part for a regulator comes in designing the application to the bidding process. So what type of firms are you going to allow to apply? So for example, like if I'm going back to the trash pickup, okay, am I going to require any applicant to have evidence that they've already been able to do this successfully? So for example, am I only going to look at firms that have picked up trash somewhere else? Am I going to require those businesses to have a certain level of capitalization, that is a certain amount of money on hand? Am I going to require them to have evidence of expertise? In other words, am I going to have them submit the resumes of their executives? Am I going to require certain aspects of service? In other words, am I going to require them, so when they tell me they can provide trash service to each household for $20, am I going to tell them, okay, well, trash service means so many liters each week, right? Okay, you're going to pick up at least this many liters of trash. In other words, am I going to make it explicit what the level of service and the quality of service is? Am I going to require them to provide recycling when they bid? Okay, you see, all the terms of what we want done need to be completely explicit before you even start the bidding process. So as a regulator, you need to fully envision what you want to see out of this, okay, and make it explicit ahead of that bidding process. I can remember one of these that I worked on, and I know I try to keep these stories for the actual class, right? But one of these where I worked on where we were bidding for buoys. I know it was this when I worked in maritime stuff, so like navigation buoys. And boy, I tell you, I learned a lot about what goes into navigation buoys, and spoke to a lot of marine engineers and safety people and everything else, because we had to be extremely explicit about each aspect of what that buoy was going to have. It was going to be so big, it would need to survive in certain weather conditions, right? It needed to have certain lighting, visible with certain amount of candle power, and so on. I mean, no joke, I want to say it was about 15 pages of description. So you need to be really explicit of what you're asking these people to do, because otherwise, of course, right, a firm's say, sure, I can provide, say, trash pickup for 50 cents per household, but yeah, we're only picking up this here, you can fill up this bottle with trash each week and we'll pick that up. Okay. So it can be tricky, right? It's not just an easy thing where you just say, okay, who can provide this, and then call it a day. Now, on top of that really sort of need to sort of fully specify what you want, right? An additional complication can come in where if you're asking firms to sort of pay, or as if they pay a specific franchise fee, what you're doing is otherwise imposing a tax on the firm, right? And so over here we see sort of the formalization of that problem. So here I'm going to use the mouse because it's too small. Okay, so D, demand, average cost, right, in this industry. Okay, P's, right, Q's, we recognize price and quantity, same as before. So what remains then is this little alpha term here, and this is this fee that we're going to require our producer to adhere to. Okay, so we see that shows up here and here, and so this function here then becomes the revenues that the firm is going to receive for providing service. And of course that would normally be based upon the demand function, which it still is, but now it's also a function of this fee. So by essentially taxing firms, right, what you're going to end up with is a situation where prices end up being somewhat higher. Are they higher to the extent of the fee? No, not exactly, because of course this elasticity of the demand curve, we recall that from first year microeconomics. And then also the quantity of service is reduced, right? So anytime we try to sort of take a cut out of sort of the returns in the private sector, we should expect a slight increase in prices. It depends upon elasticity, right? But an increase in prices and a decrease in service. Now, as regulators and also as members of the public, it's now incumbent upon us to weigh that, right? So just because, so a lot of times economists will present this picture like, oh, well, you're imposing a tax, so therefore it's bad, right? Because higher prices, less service, and so forth and so forth. But taxes, of course, provide services. And so what we really need to decide is, yes, that makes for a bad, but there's also this potential good then, right? So are the sort of goods of requiring this fee going to exceed the bads? So sort of second level of thing to think about with franchise bidding. Okay, a third issue, right? So if we're tallying these up, franchise bidding. First issue, what do you really want? You need to be explicit. Second issue, you're imposing costs that wouldn't otherwise be there, so therefore you need to recognize that a cost you impose are going to impact the price and quantity of service. Third issue, once you've issued the franchise, how do you keep that pressure on to that franchisee to provide high quality service at a reasonable price? Okay. Because of course if you award the franchise for, let's say, 50 years, and that may be appropriate in some cases, right? So if you were thinking it might be shorter, right? Well, it might be, right, or it might be longer. It depends upon what you're talking about, and we'll get into that a little later on. And if you take this class, that's what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. Sort of what would be the optimal contract length. Okay, but you need to think about like what you're going to do, how you're going to design this to ensure that 3, 5, 7 years down the road, that franchisee is still doing what you want them to do. Okay, now there's two sides to this, right? There's the side from the franchisee. You want to make sure they don't become sort of a monopolist and lay back and not really do a very good job and take it easy, right? But then also you may find that what you want changes. It might be that initially you want a certain type of recycling with your trash pickup, and then 5 years later you want a much more extensive system. Okay, so there can be cases from both sides of the transaction where you want that contract term to be shorter. Now, why would you ever want it to be longer? Well, if you have a situation where there's significant fixed costs, then you're going to have to make that contract term longer to really get anybody to bid. Okay, so that's sort of the short version of that. Okay, fourth thing, right? So we've got 3 now, and the fourth thing, we see a formalization over here, building upon this last idea that sort of things can change over time. Here we're showing the idea that let's say you award the franchise to a given firm, and then it comes back up 5 years later, and in fact somebody else could actually operate with lower costs. Well, here we see the illustration that the current franchisee actually might have an interest in undercutting a potential entrant, even though the entrant can operate at lower costs. Okay, let's walk through it. AC, it looks like an I to me, is incumbent. Okay, so the ACI is the incumbent's cost structure. ACN is the newcomer's cost structure. So the existing franchisee operates with ACI, and a new firm that could come in and take the franchise away is ACN. Okay, AVCI is the variable cost, average variable cost associated with the incumbent firm. Okay, so we see that the newcomer is more efficient, right, than the incumbent. However, okay, the incumbent firm may be willing to bid lower than the newcomer because, okay, they can of course cover their variable costs. So for example, if they bid between P bar and whatever this P is, okay, so they maybe bid, say, around here, they can of course more than cover their variable costs, but more than cover their variable costs, but be operating less efficiently than the newcomer. Now you might say, well, isn't that okay, right? I mean, isn't that just cutting into their profits? Well, no. what it means is that the incumbent firm now is not covering its fixed costs. In other words, when it comes time to repair let's say it's still trash, when it comes time to repair the trash trucks, they're not going to have the money to do that. When it comes time to maybe rebuild their office building, they're not going to have the money to do that. In other words, what they're going to do is they're going to end up running down the infrastructure of whatever service they're providing. And they're also likely to utilize less effective internal resources. Okay, so now that we've talked about those sort of 4 obstacles associated with franchising bidding, well, it's really 4.5, right? What are some ways we can sort of mitigate those problems? Well, one thing we can do is when we award the franchise, we can allow for certain ongoing negotiating room in the contract. So, for example, we might say something like, okay, well, we're going to hold open the option to renegotiate aspects of this franchise, throughout the exclusive contract. So let's say maybe you give a firm 10 years to operate in this market. You might say, okay, well, we're going to say every 2 years we're going to review the relationship, and we require that there be certain latitude to renegotiate from both sides. Of course, you're going to have to do that from both sides. Negotiate this relationship. Now, of course, this makes it trickier, right? Okay. I'm laughing because this is what I'm in the middle of right now. Okay. A problem you can get into in this, right? So when you continually renegotiate these sort of contracts, it is, of course, there can be incentives to sort of not get it done, right? So like you start renegotiating it, and let's say the franchise, you would really like to keep things the way they are, right? Okay, well, maybe you just keep the renegotiation process going as long as you can, right? Because then the old terms just hold. That can definitely be a thing. Like I said, I'm laughing, sort of experiencing that. You can try to build into the contracts limitations on ability of either side to do that sort of thing, but recognize that it's going to be a thing. Recognize that the more times you have a contract open for renegotiation, or the more latitude you put into the contract, the more possibility there is for sort of strategic gaming of the process. Okay, we've managed to keep this one relatively short, so that's good, right? We'll try to keep more like this going forward. But that's it for this time, and next time we'll be talking about another exciting idea in regulatory economics, optimal pricing. Okay, take care, everybody. Have a good day. We'll see you soon.